All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. If you have not had a chance to check out the listener's commentary app, I regularly hear from people how much easier it makes the commentary to use. And so I would encourage you just to check out the app if you use the commentary regularly. The great advantage of it is you can select which Bible book you're studying, and instead of having to scroll back through a feed, you can just choose whichever book you're studying and just work your way through it right there. And so it makes it a lot more accessible and easier to use. So Listener's Commentary app available on the App Store, Google Play, wherever you get your apps. And so encourage you maybe to check that out if it sounds like it might be helpful to you. All right, in this recording, we're going to be looking at John chapter 15, verses 12 through 27. And once again, just to remind us, it's the night before Jesus' crucifixion. He has celebrated the Passover in an upper room with his closest friends, his disciples or his apostles. And it seems as if now he has left the upper room and he's on his way out of the city, somewhere in the city. And eventually we'll get to chapter 18 where he comes out of the city and across the Kidron Valley and up into the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. So that's where he's at, and that's the setting. And in the previous paragraph from our last recording, Jesus had told the apostles that if you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. And that really sets up this section that begins with love, specifically loving one another. And so the two main topics in 15:12 through 27 are loving one another and being hated by the world. So we pick up in John chapter 15, verse 12, where Jesus says to them, "This is my commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you." And Jesus already said that love like this is the hallmark of his followers. He said that in John chapter 13:35, earlier on in the evening. It's what makes his followers stand out in the world as followers or disciples of Jesus. And this kind of love is driven by commitment way more than feeling. And that was one of the unique things about Christian love was it was a commitment to the good and well-being of another person, regardless of how we felt or regardless of what we got out of it in return. And notice here in verse 12 that it's a verb, and that's good for us to remember. That means it's an action or a set of actions that we take on behalf of others, and thus it can be commanded. This is my commandment, that you love one another. This isn't just like a suggestion. This is a call to action. And the pattern of that set of actions known as love by Jesus is Jesus' own love for us. His love for us motivated him to lay down his life for us in small ways and ultimately in a big way on the cross. That's the pattern. And that's what Jesus calls his disciples to do, to love one another. So Jesus goes on to draw attention to that pattern. He says this, "Greater love has no one than this, than a person will lay down his life for his friends." Jesus is going to go on and call them his friends shortly. And that reminds us really what the pattern is. What is the pattern of Jesus' love for us that we're supposed to imitate in our love for one another? Well, it's laying down our lives for them, just like Jesus laid down his life for us. Greater love has no one than that. Jesus goes on in verse 14 and says, "You are my friends if you do what I command you." And what has he commanded us? To love one another just like he loved us. "No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing." He doesn't know his master's business or affairs. He simply knows what his master told him to do, and he has to go do that. But Jesus says, "I have called you friends." And the reason for that is because all the things I've heard from my Father, I've made known to you. I've been open and upfront, and I've shown you everything that the Father and I are doing and are about. You know what I'm up to. You know my business because I've shared it with you. And that's one of the things that marks them out as Jesus' friends. Then Jesus goes on in verse 16 and says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you would go and bear fruit, that your fruit would remain, so that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give to you. Now, notice what Jesus says. You didn't choose me, I chose you. Typically, in Jesus's world, a would-be disciple would choose a particular rabbi, a rabbi that they really related with and appreciated the teaching of. They would choose that rabbi, and they would ask that rabbi to become his disciple. That's the way the rabbi-discipleship relationship worked in Jesus' day. The disciple would choose the rabbi. But in the case of his disciples, Jesus broke with that typical way of doing things, and he chose them. He called them and invited them to be his disciples. And that's the original intention of these words here. Jesus is speaking to his apostles, those disciples that he has chosen to be his official representatives and to carry on his mission after he leaves. He chose them. So the original intention of these words is that in their world and in their context, and that cautions us from over-theologizing these words into a general doctrine of election. Nevertheless, the immediate context of his disciples being Jesus' friends and Jesus saying that he chose them for that role emphasizes their place with him, emphasizes the friendship they share with him was his idea. It was his plan. He initiated it. And that really offers a deep encouragement. He chose them to be his disciples and friends. And that context then provides really a framework, a basis, and even an environment in which loving one another is possible. Loving one another makes sense. And so Jesus now, after kind of laying all that out, restates the command that started this whole section. Jesus says in verse 17, "This I command you, that you love one another." And so he stated it in verse 12. He states it again here in verse 17. Here's what he expects them to do, and here's what he expects us to do as disciples. And what makes that possible for them and ultimately for us, though the details are different, is the love relationship that we share with Jesus. His love for us is both the pattern, but also the source of our love for one another. He goes on then in verse 18 and says, now, that's your relationship with one another, but on the outside, with the world, things are a little bit different. And so he says in verse 18, if the world hates you, you know that it's hated me before it hated you. In other words, if the world hates disciples of Jesus, well, then we as disciples of Jesus, we're in good company because it hated Jesus too. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you. And so the reason for the hostility from the world towards them and from the world towards all followers of Jesus is really twofold. We're not of the world, but we have been chosen by Jesus to be out of or apart from the world. We're distinct. We're something different than the world. And when Jesus says, if you were of the world would love you, but because you're not of the world, it hates you. Well, to be of the world means to be from it, to be of its character, to be of its values, with the world being the source of your identity and your way of life. But disciples aren't that. Disciples are not of the world. They're not of its values, character. They don't get their identity from it. Jesus chose them as his apostles, and really all other disciples, he chose them to be out of the world. Not physically, obviously, out of the world. Those disciples were physically still in the world, and as you watch their ministry unfold in the book of Acts, they're going to fully engage with the world, but their character and their way of life and their identity and their values and their priorities are distinct from the world. And that's the way it is with disciples. The sense of self does not come from the world. It comes from somewhere else. And because of that, the world hates us. Jesus actually says in verse 20, remember the word that I said to you. A slave isn't greater than his master. This was part of his earlier teaching to them. A slave isn't greater than his master. If they persecuted me, Jesus says, they will persecute you as well. If they followed my word, they would follow yours also. In other words, disciples of Jesus get the same treatment that Jesus himself got. If they hate Jesus, they'll hate us. If they listen to Jesus, they'll listen to us. And Jesus says, now all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they don't know the one who sent me. So ultimately, it all comes down to the fact that they don't know God. So the hostility that followers of Jesus experience, they experience because of their connection with God, specifically God in Jesus, and therefore they're distinct from the world. And since the world doesn't know God and hates Jesus, well, guess what? They're going to treat Jesus' followers the same way. Then Jesus actually says something quite interesting in verse 22. He says, if I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. Now we need to think clearly about what Jesus is saying, and the following context, what Jesus says next, makes it clear that he's not talking about sin in general. When he says they would not have sin, he's not saying they would be sinless, like completely and totally in general, if he hadn't come. That's not what he's saying. The following context makes it clear that the problem is the specific sin of resisting and rejecting Jesus, their Messiah. So look what Jesus says in verse 23, because it makes it clear. He says, the one who hates me hates my Father also. So they're Jews. They say they know the Father. They have the scriptures. And yet the fact that they have hated and have been hostile towards Jesus actually makes it clear that they don't know God. They're hostile towards God. The one who hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works which no one else has done, they would not have sinned. So you get the clarity there that what he's talking about is specifically their rejection of him. If he hadn't done his works, if he hadn't come, they wouldn't have the sin of rejecting him and resisting their Messiah. But now they've both seen and hated me and my Father as well. And so that's the sin that Jesus has in mind, their rejection of Jesus as Messiah. But this has happened, Jesus says, so that the word that is written in their law will be fulfilled. They hated me for no reason. That's actually a quote from Psalm 69:4, which means Jesus is using the idea of law in verse 25, like generally for their scriptures. And Psalm 69:4 is a psalm of David, and that verse is specifically about being hated without cause. And Jesus says what was true of David is true of Jesus in the same way, to the same degree, maybe even a greater degree, as David's greater son. Now, how can disciples face the hate and the hostility that's going to come their way from the world? How can they, whom Jesus is talking to, his apostles, carry out the work they're supposed to do? How can later disciples continue to carry out the work that we're supposed to do? Well, Jesus comes back to something that he had already told them earlier in the evening. Look at verse 26. When the Helper comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, namely the Spirit of truth who comes from the Father, he will testify about me, and you are testifying as well, because you have been with me from the beginning. Couple things to note out of those two verses. First, notice how it ends, because you've been with me from the beginning. That is, Jesus identifies that he is talking to his apostles, the ones he's chosen from the very beginning of his ministry. We actually learn in Acts chapter 1, this was a crucial quality of being a disciple. You had to be there from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, right at the baptism of John the Baptist, all the way up through the resurrection and seeing the resurrection. Well, Jesus is speaking to those men here in this context. And as the apostles, they have a unique calling to testify about Jesus. Now, we, as followers of Jesus, continue to testify to him, but our testimony actually relies on the testimony of the apostles, those who were with him from the beginning and could give their own eyewitness testimony to Jesus. So we need to keep that in mind when Jesus says, you have been with me from the beginning. Now, he also says when the Helper comes, he's going to help you do this. And recall that earlier in the evening, Jesus had already introduced the coming of the Helper. He had done so in John chapter 14, verses 16 and 17. He said there that I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper so that he may be with you forever. The helper is the Spirit of truth whom the world can't receive because it does not see him or know him. But you know him because he remains with you and will be in you. And so here again, he says, when the Helper comes, and he even gives him the same title, the Spirit of truth. That's who the Helper is. He's the Spirit who is going to testify to the truth about Jesus. And we should recall that in our explanation of John 14, 16, and 17, we said that the word for helper is parakletos in Greek, and it has the sense of supporter, strengthener, fortifier. The Spirit of truth, in other words, is the one who comes alongside the apostles and future followers of Jesus to strengthen them. And Jesus had said in chapter 17, not only will he be alongside you, he'll also be in you. And so the Spirit will be sent by God the Father on behalf of Jesus to strengthen and fortify his followers. And notice that here, specifically, one of the things that the Spirit does for them and for us is to help us in our testifying about Jesus. He says that the Spirit will testify about me. That's part of his role in being sent into the world after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, is to testify to Jesus, and he does that through Jesus' people. So he says, you are testifying as well because you've been with me from the beginning. And so they can endure the hostility from the world and continue to carry out their mission because they have the help of the Spirit. And so as we wrap up this section, it's important for us just to keep in mind the two big themes that we see here. First, within their own community life, towards each other, as the people of Jesus, as the new family of Jesus, the thing that is to mark us out is loving one another. Remember, this is the night before Jesus is crucified. He's sharing some of his most important aims and purposes and desires with them. And the heart of that is, love one another as I have loved you. That's the pattern, and that's the mark. That's what Jesus wants for us as we live in this world as his disciples. And so our community life together should be marked out by self-sacrificial, self-giving love that imitates the pattern of Jesus, where we lower ourselves and lay down our lives to serve our brothers and sisters in the new family of Jesus. Love one another as I have loved you. And in our relationship to those outside of the family of Jesus, what Jesus has said here, it's not the only word on the subject, but it is an important word on the subject, and that word is this. In relationship to the world outside of the new family of Jesus, we should expect hostility. Expect hostility. That's what Jesus said. Don't be surprised by that. That's going to happen. If they hated Jesus, they'll hate you. If they listen to Jesus, they'll listen to you. We should expect that. It's not necessarily because there's something wrong with us. It's because that they have rejected Jesus, they despise Jesus, and as a result, they're going to mistreat and be hostile towards Jesus' people. So we should expect it and not be surprised by it. In fact, the Apostle Paul says to the Thessalonian believers, do not be surprised by these hardships, these afflictions that have come upon you. He says to the elders at the end of his first missionary journey, as he travels back to the churches he planted, he says to the leaders of those churches to expect hardships. That's just part of what it means to follow Jesus in a world that rejects him and has turned their back on their Creator. And so in our relationship to one another, love one another like Jesus loved you. In relationship to the world, don't be surprised if they mistreat you, they slander you, and they're hostile towards you. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's possible only because of the generosity of folks just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you have been impacted or blessed by this ministry in any way, would you prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? The easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and it'll redirect you to my page through World Family Mission, registered nonprofit, where you can set up a one time or a recurring monthly donation. Those monies then will get sent to me. Or you could sign up for the study hub right there at listenerscommentary.com as well. That's another great way to support this ministry. All recurring monthly donors, whether they're signing up through the study hub or through the give button, they all get access to some of the bonus materials inside the study hub, some online courses and some other materials. And I will keep adding materials as I get time and get a chance, and create some materials just to help you dig in and learn and live the scriptures. Thanks a ton for your support.